right, well, welcome everyone to this presentation on nature-based climate solutions for homeowners. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that our work at EOS Eco Energy is done on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Mi'kmaq. And today's webinar is the last in our event series called How Nature Can Help Us Adapt to Climate Change. This event series has been organized in partnership with the Chignecto Climate Change Collaborative. And if you're not sure who they are, it's a network of professionals working on climate adaptation issues across the Chignecto border region. Today's speaker is Adam Cheeseman, and Adam lives and works here in Sicknick, at the unceded Mi'kmaq territory in the town of Sackville. In his role as Director of Conservation with Nature-NB, Adam manages the organization's climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation planning projects, with a focus on nature-based climate solutions and community-based conservation planning and collaboration. Adam is particularly interested in how climate change adaptation and environmental conservation can be intertwined as a way to address both the biodiversity and climate crises. And outside of work, Adam enjoys kayaking and camping and traveling and his ever-expanding vegetable garden. So before I turn things over to Adam, I just want to ask everyone to remain muted. We'll keep questions to the end just so that we can stay on schedule because we've just got the noon hour. And you can either write your questions in the chat box along the way so you don't forget them, and I can relay them to Adam at the end. But then I'll also open up questions, for verbal questions at the end, especially if you're joining us on the phone. So thank you so much, Adam, and I turn things over to you now.
Perfect. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining in. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new names too. That's awesome. Okay, I'm just gonna take a second to share my screen, make sure everything's working okay with that. We did do a practice and now I can't get it to work, so just bear with me for a second. There we go. Okay, perfect. So yeah, so this is, as Amanda mentioned, kind of the last in a series of different presentations that were focused on how nature can help us adapt to climate change. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot over the last 4 or 5 years is really around natural infrastructure, nature-based adaptation, and what people can do. More so, focus on local governments and provincial governments and NGOs and that sort of thing in terms of what professionals can do. But more and more we're hearing from different folks about, well, what can I do, what can I do at home to work with nature to help adapt to climate change. And so over the past couple of years, we've given presentations to lots of different groups, like the different gardening clubs, for example, across the province, and other kind of recreation and nature groups across the province. And so this is kind of just a bunch of information that we've kind of pulled out from some of those talks, as well as I'll talk about a number of projects that are kind of ongoing in the Southeast New Brunswick region that aren't necessarily led by Nature-NB, but are led by some awesome folks who have been really advancing climate change work in the province and in the region over the past little while. So I'll highlight some of the initiatives that are kind of ongoing and then talk a little bit about some tips, again, from some of our conversations with some of our partners and others about what homeowners can do on their own properties. So just to give a quick intro to Nature-NB, Nature-NB is a provincial non-for-profit charitable organization. Our mission is to celebrate, conserve, and protect New Brunswick's natural heritage. And we typically engage in this through education, networking, and collaboration. So our organization started in 1972 as kind of a coming together of all the different naturalist clubs or nature clubs from around the province. And so we work really closely with local volunteers and local naturalists on the ground on a number of our projects, and also with a number of partners from all across the province, whether they be watershed organizations or other provincial non-for-profits or federal non-for-profits. So we have a lot of different partnerships that we involve in our work. And this year we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary, which is exciting. So I'm including on the slide our new 50th anniversary logo for those who haven't seen it. And this is just another slide to talk a little bit about what we do. So we have a number of different projects that we focus on around education. So educating and doing nature education in schools and outside of schools. We have a number of stewardship and citizen science related initiatives in protected areas across the province. We do a number of conservation planning and species at risk conservation work with various partners. And of course, we have our climate change work, which I'll talk about mostly today. And we also have an annual Festival of Nature where we get naturalists and other groups from across the province together once a year in a different location, depending on the year, across the province to celebrate some of our natural heritage that we have in the province with field trips and outings. And so our upcoming Festival of Nature is in June of this year in Fredericton. For those who want to check that out, there's more information on the website as well. So what are we doing on climate change? So our focus on climate change has been over the past few years really focused around working on nature-based climate change adaptation and trying to mainstream it and make it, a really important and mainstreamed approach to how people are thinking about climate change and what they're doing in terms of action. And so this is focused around a number of things like building capacity of different professional groups and locals to respond to some change. Sharing successes and lessons learned is a big one. So kind of taking projects that have worked in other areas and kind of helping communicate that out and work with others to expand them, and education as well as collaboration. So I've included a link to a community of practice website that we helped build in partnership with the New Brunswick Environmental Network through a Natural Resources Canada project that's just wrapping up this year. And that project has really been focused on doing a number of these things in terms of working to mainstream nature-based climate adaptation. And what I mean by nature-based climate adaptation, and we've heard about this in a number of the speakers as well who've been a part of this event series, but really it's about thinking about how can we work with nature to help ourselves prepare and adapt to future changes. And so we're very familiar with some of the gray kind of engineered infrastructure approaches to adaptation, whether that be placing rock or riprap along our shorelines to help reduce erosion, or upgrading culverts, for example, to accommodate more heavy flows that are coming across the landscape. Something that a lot of us are thinking about given the weather that we've been having lately in our part of the world. And more, there's an increasing kind of recognition for the opportunities that exist in terms of working with nature to help adapt to climate change. And so not only thinking about these engineered approaches, but also thinking about what is currently on the landscape in terms of, coastal wetlands and forests, grasslands, and thinking about how can we, manage and restore and conserve those spaces in order to help us prepare and adapt to future changes. So whether that be, working to think about coastal wetlands as a buffer between communities and the ocean in the context of sea level rise or coastal erosion, working on living shoreline projects, which we'll talk about in a little bit, around revitalizing biodiversity, but also protecting some of the dunes and beaches and the coastlines that we do have. So those sorts of projects. And so I think there's a number of different approaches that we can take when it comes to nature-based adaptation. And there's very kind of a large scale, big picture pieces. Then there's also a lot of things that people can do kind of individually on the ground to have an impact. And this is just a slide that I wanted to show that highlights a couple of things. The first, this is our screenshot just from that community of practice website that I mentioned earlier, which it's a naturalinfrastructurenb.ca, which I encourage everybody to check out. Depending on where you're tuning in from, I saw in the chat earlier that there's people kind of from all across Canada that are participating. And so we have projects in partnership with the New Brunswick Environmental Network and Nature Canada that we've been collecting information on to help communicate, different types of nature-based adaptation projects. And we've expanded this nationally. So there's projects all across the country that are on this map, and you can click on each one of these pins and kind of learn a little bit about what the project is, who led it, maybe have a website link or some pictures. And this just helps to facilitate kind of more information sharing and education around this approach, not only in New Brunswick, but also elsewhere. So I'd encourage folks to check that out if they're interested in learning a little bit more. And I just wanted to highlight, a couple of examples of what we're talking about when we think about nature-based adaptation. This is a picture of the naturalized stormwater pond here in Sackville that was recently completed. And this project is a really good example of a nature-based climate solution in which the town's been dealing with a lot of issues with freshwater flooding in this part of town. And instead of just digging a large ditch or a large pit for all of the stormwater to run into, the town was forward thinking in terms of, how can we work with, some of the existing natural features that are in this space on the landscape, create more of a natural system where water can be stored and then flow out through the dikes into the Bay of Fundy, but also protect, some of the existing forests and trees that are in there. And in addition to that, incorporate kind of a recreation trail that connects in with some of the other municipal parks within the town. So this is a really good example of that type of work. Another one, which is a very common example and a lot of work that's gone in from our local watershed groups in the region, so Vision H2O or Shediac Bay Watershed Association, EOS, as well as the Cookine Sustainable Development Group. I've done a lot of work on naturalized stormwater management, whether that be through planting rain gardens or bioswale projects. And really what this is about slowing down water on the landscape, allowing it to have a space to infiltrate back into the ground. And these are some examples that I'll get into later about some of the things that we can do on our own properties in terms of slowing down water, allowing it to absorb, and reducing that potential impact of flooding or other damage like that water can cause through erosion or otherwise. There's also kind of a growing recognition for an approach to, and this is less at the homeowner level, but more at kind of the community level, around looking at what natural assets exist in a particular area and thinking about what services those provide and what services we would lose if we were to lose those natural assets. So there's a group called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative that's been working with a number of partners across Canada, including the Southeast Regional Service Commission here locally, and thinking about, when we're planning new subdivisions, for example, that has an existing wetland or an existing forest on it, if we were to remove all those natural spaces, we would lose that ability for that water to be able to be held on the landscape. And so if we put in pavement, we put in roofs, all that water is going to be starting to run off. And so we're going to have to build more stormwater infrastructure. So there's a cost associated with actually removing those natural assets as they're referred to in this case. And so when we're thinking about things like subdivision design or water supply areas for our communities, there's a lot of work now going into thinking about, well, what are the replacement costs when it comes to, if we remove 5 hectares of forest that might be holding on to some rainwater and some stormwater during a severe weather event, what is it going to cost for us to replace that with engineered infrastructure? And does it make sense to replace it with engineered infrastructure? Or should we be kind of structuring our communities and changing how we're thinking about building around some of these natural assets that exist on the landscape? And so just as an example, in the town of Riverview, just outside Moncton not too long ago, they went through one of these assessments and found that a wetland complex that was within an area that they were hoping to develop into a subdivision or develop in as part of the town was actually contributing about upwards of $2 or $3 million in stormwater management services for free for the town. So that's what they're starting to think about in terms of does it make sense to change the landscape in a way that we're going to have to pay and invest and maintain that stormwater infrastructure over time. Another example that I mentioned before, of course, are living shorelines, which is gaining a lot of momentum and kind of traction in our part of the world and in many others. And so living shorelines kind of flips this idea of coastal protection on its head, and thinking about, a very dominant approach in our region and many other regions is to use, rock armoring and riprap stone to protect coastlines from erosion. And more we're seeing that, during extreme weather events and in other situations, these types of projects can protect some from erosion, but another approach, or an approach to kind of weave in with those rock approaches, are this idea of living shorelines. And so planting natural native vegetation that has deep roots that can hold and kind of anchor onto some of that sediment and some of that soil, again, to prevent that, or reduce, I guess, the amount of erosion that's occurring, and also start to reintroduce some of those native species along the coastline. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. So why nature-based adaptation? So talk a little bit about some bigger projects, not necessarily at the homeowner level yet, but why focus on this and not other types of adaptation or mitigation? And this is really just because even if we flip the switch in terms of turning off all of our carbon emissions, we're still going to be facing the impacts of climate change. And so we're still going to be experiencing changing in temperatures. We're still going to be experiencing changes in precipitation patterns. We're going to see that increased extreme weather, and we're going to see sea level rise. So that's not to say that mitigation isn't needed as well. But what we need to do, more and more is think about where are these win-win approaches in terms of, protecting communities, mitigating the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere, and also, contributing to some of these co-benefits like recreation or community revitalization, or protecting wildlife habitat and species at risk habitat and these sorts of things. So it's really about thinking about, where are these win-win approaches, and that's where we think that the nature-based adaptation work has a lot of potential. And it's not just us. So Nature United, a national NGO, recently released a report called "Innovating for Climate Change," where they found that not only can it help, with adaptation in terms of what we've been talking about, but nature-based climate solutions can also reduce Canada's annual greenhouse gas emissions by an amount equal to powering every single home in Canada for 3 years. And so this is really focused around protecting what we currently have. So protecting our wetlands, protecting our forests, for reasons that we've already talked about in terms of, holding on to stormwater, and leveraging some of those other services that they provide in terms of mitigating carbon from the atmosphere, and also around management and restoration. And when looking at it from kind of a province by province or territory by territory perspective, New Brunswick actually had some of the largest potential in terms of recognizing the importance and the role that nature-based climate solutions can play than any other Atlantic province in the region, which was kind of interesting that they came out that way. And so again, the short answer for all this is, for us, is why nature-based adaptation. It's the co-benefits. So when we have healthy systems and healthy ecosystems, we're going to be getting a number of other benefits with that. And so we may want to, do a rock armoring project, or we may want to, upgrade the size of all of our culverts, which are all important things. But it is important to recognize that by investing in nature, we're also achieving a number of other benefits, like, planting upstream forests. We're, having air filtering services, we're having carbon sequestration services, while also holding on to some of that flood water. Large buffers and distance between the coastline or our river systems and where people are building gives, protections for water quality, for example. There's opportunities for tourism and recreation that come with these types of projects, and we're protecting habitat as well as controlling erosion. So there's a number of these kind of free services that come into play that we can think about when we're investing into nature. And so the return on investment is very high with these sorts of projects. So I just wanted to highlight, before kind of jumping into the main content of the presentation in terms of what homeowners can do, that we are in a situation, for those of us who live in New Brunswick, having an exciting opportunity to contribute to the province's next climate change action plan. And I just wanted to highlight this really quickly in terms of this presentation. Today is February 24th, and the public engagement piece around this plan ends later today. So I would encourage folks to check that out if any of the content we've talked about today or through the rest of the event series has kind of spurred any ideas or thoughts in your mind about what New Brunswick could be doing differently, or add into its next climate change action plan. There's an opportunity there to have your voice heard on that one as well. And so diving in a little bit more in terms of what individuals can do and what homeowners can do in terms of incorporating more natural features into their properties to take climate action. The way that I kind of like to think about this is around the circular economy. So for those who aren't necessarily familiar with this term, the circular economy is thinking about, the economy or our whole society as a matter of thinking about it as from a systems perspective. So thinking about everything is interconnected, and trying to shift the mindset away from traditional industrial economic activity to, how can our economic activity and what we're using and what we're consuming be restorative and regenerative for both human society as well as the environment, instead of detrimental. And so, this is just one of many diagrams you can find out there that kind of talk about the circular economy, but it's thinking about, how do we design our goods and our services so that when they are being used, as much as possible is being redesigned or rethought in terms of reducing what we're using. And if we're not reducing, focusing on reusing and remanufacturing and recycling, and then recovering as much of that as possible, and then trying to create that circular loop to bring it back to the beginning, so that we're, not, wasting as much from the perspective of not only, waste that we produce, but also about the goods and the services that we're doing, and really focusing on that regenerative aspect of our lives. And so that's kind of the framing, or kind of the outlook that we can take when we're thinking, I think, about how do we incorporate these nature-based adaptation kind of thinking onto our own properties as homeowners. And so there's a number of individual actions that we'll cover today. And I just want to recognize again that, it's not that Nature and Bee is definitely, thought about any of these or were the original thinkers about all of these. It's really, ideas that we've gleaned from a number of our colleagues and a number of our partners in our work over the last few years. And in conversations with people from all across the province who have, tried things and done different things. So a lot of different kind of perspectives and expertise has kind of gone into building some of these actions. And it's definitely not an exhaustive list either. And so hopefully we'll have some time once we wrap up to kind of talk about, what other people have done, or if other people have resources they want to share, and that sort of thing going forward. So the first one, I mean, one of the big topics, of course, is what can we do in our own backyards, and what can we do in our own yards to help, mitigate and adapt climate change at that local level. And there's a number of pieces that we'll talk about in conjunction with that. And I think that a lot of it kind of comes back to the idea of the circular economy, in terms of making sure that whatever we're bringing in, we're cycling as much of that back into our backyards or back into our properties as possible. So the first one, of course, is composting and mulching. There's a lot of benefits that mulching specifically can have in terms of suppressing weeds, of course, but it also helps to reduce our watering needs. There's limited or fewer inputs that we need to make from that perspective. And there's also some more recent research that's coming out to say that mulching our plants and mulching around our properties can actually reduce nitrous oxide that comes out of our soils as well, which nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. So you're also helping kind of on the mitigation side of things as well. Composting as well is a really great tool that we can all use to help reduce food waste, which helps reduce if we're thinking about that circular economy diagram, that waste that's coming out at the end. It increases self-sufficiency in terms of being able to use some of that compost on our gardens, whether that be vegetable gardens or plant gardens. And it reduces those greenhouse gas emissions that are required for our household compost to be transported to the landfill. If you even have composting that is accepted at municipal landfill, which is, I know, a challenge in many other places still. So 2 quick tips on that one. Native trees and shrubs. So there's a lot of work that's been done by groups like Tree Canada and others to there's lots of guides out there for homeowners in terms of how to plan planting trees around your home and how to kind of maximize that potential. But at a higher level, evergreens and coniferous trees can help to cut wind. And so those are really great trees to have along or kind of nearby to your home where it can cut some of that wind, so it's not blasting against your house as much, particularly in the winter, which can help reduce heating costs in the winter. While deciduous trees, of course, when they don't have their leaves, can help to have an open kind of canopy area where the sunlight can come in and hit the house during the winter to, again, reduce on warming costs, and you're getting more of that solar energy heating your home. And in the summer, you have the added benefit of when you have all that leaf out, that foliage, you're casting shade on your home, which can reduce your cooling costs in the summer. So thinking about kind of where you're planting trees and what types of trees you're planting on your property can play a pretty big role. And at least, specifically in our region, and talking with groups like the Fundy Biosphere Reserve and Community Forest International, there's a lot of work kind of going into thinking about what are some of the tree species that we want to be planting in our yards when we're thinking about not only, sucking carbon from the atmosphere, but also thinking about what trees are going to be growing well over time when we're thinking about climate change. And so in our region, focusing on tree species like eastern hemlock, red oak, sugar, red maple, and beech, as these tree species are the ones that are predicted to be doing well in terms of how our climate is shifting in the future. And in some of my recent conversations with some experts in this area, they've actually suggested trying to focus on, if you are thinking about purchasing some plants from nurseries, for example, focusing on trying to find disease-resistant varieties, because one of the impacts from climate change that we're not 100% sure how it's all going to play out yet is the changes in pests and different insects that might impact our tree species over time. So, trying to find that native stock that is disease resistant or has been created to be disease resistant against pests that we know about can be beneficial as well if we're thinking about kind of longer term investment and maintenance for trees and shrubs on your own property. And of course, one thing I don't have on this slide that I'll mention too is thinking about some native trees and shrubs that produce food that either we can eat or the wildlife that may rely on our backyards as stopover sites, whether it be for migration or for pollinators that then can also benefit from those plants being around. Of course, then there's rainwater harvesting and rain barrels. So there's a number of groups locally in the region who have listed here who have some really great rainwater harvesting and rain barrel programs, including EOS. And rain barrels can be a really great addition to your property in terms of reducing water consumption. When we're thinking about, especially in the context of climate change, where we're thinking about some of these more flashy rain events where we have a lot of rain falling in a very short period of time and the ground's not able to soak a lot of that up, or our gardens aren't able to soak a lot of that up, and a lot of it ends up rushing across the landscape. If we have these sort of rainwater harvesting and rain barrels in place, we're able to store some of that water and use it for our purposes in terms of watering, making ourselves more resilient in terms of not necessarily needing to always be relying on water supplies during those really flashy events and a period of a drier spell and that sort of thing. So definitely I would encourage folks, no matter where you are, to check out your local watershed groups, as a number of them have or had some rain barrel giveaways or rain barrel sales, or would love to hear more about that, I'm sure. Another thing that we can do, even just at a small scale, if in your vegetable gardens or some of your other gardens, is think about cover cropping. So this is starting to gain a lot of traction in more broader scale agriculture. But even on a small scale, cover cropping, so planting a crop in the late fall that will come up and provide a little bit of green over the winter time, can help to trap carbon and nutrients in your soils, preserve soil health and soil quality over time. So in the spring, you can actually till or kind of just turn that cover crop right back into the soil, and you can it just helps to hold on to that soil as well during the winter conditions, in terms of let's say we don't have any snow but we have a lot of wind and it's eroding some of our soil. You can help to hold on to some of that soil by having that cover crop in place. Another option, of course, is to cover any raised beds or cover exposed soil with cardboard or hay in order to protect that soil and keep it in place over that season. And coming back to the idea of living shorelines. So this is a picture not necessarily from our neck of the woods, but I do like it in terms of the stark contrast between the different types of approach here. So living shorelines, as I talked about before, really it's a concept that focuses on working with nature to adapt coastlines to erosions and to erosion and some of the other impacts of climate change. And so as we can see, the image on the left and the image on the right, they're very different. And really the purpose of a living shoreline is in essence the same thing. It's really to work with the existing vegetation and new vegetation that's being added to anchor some of that sediment using strong roots to reduce erosion over time. But it's also producing a number of co-benefits that some of these other more traditional approaches might not be doing. So as you can imagine, there's definitely benefit for wildlife habitat from a living shoreline approach. There's benefits for native species. There's benefits for carbon mitigation in terms of the trees that we see on the left being able to pull some carbon out of the atmosphere that rocks can't necessarily do. And we have also found, in working and kind of discussing this approach with different folks who have implemented it in different areas, is there's a real opportunity with the living shoreline piece to kind of rethink how we do development as well. So, if the norm becomes okay, let's think about doing living shorelines. Let's think about working with the nature that's already even there to help us adapt. We might be in a situation where people are thinking about, okay, maybe I shouldn't be building right up against this coastline or right up against this lake or right up against this river, and giving a bit more of a buffer space. So that's what I would encourage for folks too, if you're thinking about, new builds along, let's say you're thinking of building a cottage or building a waterfront home at some point. Think about that safe distance that you want to be away from the water, thinking about how, we are going to be seeing more erosion and more extreme weather events in the future. And so thinking about, how can I work with what's currently on the property to maximize that potential in terms of reducing or kind of managing that erosion over time. And for those of us who might live, near a beach or have a beach or a dune on our property or on a place that we like to go visit, planting and maintain natural dune grasses, of course, can help stabilize sand. This is just a picture that shows, our typical beach grasses here in our region and throughout the province. And really that kind of network of roots that help to hold on and really stabilize that sediment during, we can imagine during some of those erosion events. And just some practices that we can kind of employ too, not necessarily on our own properties, but if we're going to visit the beach or going to visit a coastal area, is to avoid trampling plants and kind of walking directly over the banks. That can be an issue in terms of trampling the plants and then losing that capacity for those root systems to be able to hold onto the sediment. If you do have a coastal property, think about installing beach stairs or installing some sort of boardwalk over top of the dune or over top of one of these kind of sensitive areas to help manage erosion at the property, and avoiding breaking the beach of shells and seaweeds and that sort of stuff, as that can also play a bit of a role in terms of helping dissipate wave energy, but it also plays a really important role around habitat and help capture some invertebrates and insects that birds or other types of species might want to feed on. And just to mention too, there's some really interesting work that's going into thinking about what are some of the things that we can do kind of directly offshore of some properties or some communities or some wharves or marinas or whatever it is that you have along the coast to help protect and kind of dissipate that wave energy that's coming in. And so there's been some interesting work done in Prince Edward Island around using sandstone and large blocks of sandstone just off the coast of the beach. And as that wave energy hits, that sandstone starts to erode and the water comes behind that sandstone, slows down and actually deposits some of that eroded sandstone on the beach. So it's building the beach back up to be more resilient. There's other groups that have tried, working with oyster beds to put them just offshore to help dissipate some of that wave energy. So it's not necessarily just about kind of protecting what you have in place in terms of erosion, but you can also think about in the water, what are some of the things that we can do to help dissipate some of that wave energy coming in. And another one kind of coming back to our own properties is shrinking the lawn. So this is one that's a really interesting one as well. And so, there's obviously the concept of less grass is less gas. And so if we're using gas powered mowers and things like that, the smaller that our lawn space is, the less gas we're going to need, which translates into fewer emissions, obviously. A lot of plants, including shrubs and trees, are more capable of, bringing in carbon and storing carbon over a longer period of time than grass is. Lawns also tend to absorb less water than other plants and gardens. So if we're thinking about, flooding, especially in the spring and summer months, when the ground's thawed, some of those other types of plants and things like rain gardens, which we'll talk about shortly, are able to, suck up and hold on to a lot of that water better than lawns can. Many other plants are less water dependent. Having not just lawn on your property, but incorporating a mix of other gardens and shade trees can help with privacy and providing shade to your home and other benefits to your yard. And there's also, some interesting opportunities too in terms of working from a landscaping perspective on wildflower meadows and even selecting grass varieties that don't grow as high as traditional grass varieties as well. So you can look at late maturing grass varieties or grass varieties that only have a certain maximum height so that, maybe you only have to mow them once or twice a season. So, there's a number of alternatives that can benefit, not only your own pocket and knowing that you're taking some climate action, but also some of the species like pollinators and others that might benefit as well from having more naturalized backyards. Which brings me to rain gardens. So rain gardens, just quickly, a number of groups in our region and kind of across Canada have really taken rain gardens and run with them over the last, I would say 10 years or so. Typically rain gardens help to absorb about 30% more water than a standard lawn. And the way they're constructed is, I have this similar in the image here from the Shediac Bay Watershed Association. They have this kind of depression in the landscape with these watered loving plants that have large root systems. The water can more easily infiltrate into the ground compared to your lawn. And a number of the benefits that I just talked about in terms of reducing your lawn space really apply to rain gardens. And there's some great resources out there that are linked onto the slide that talk a lot too about kind of where to place your rain garden in your property and how to select that to get its maximum potential in terms of thinking about where water flows on your property and how it can settle out into your rain garden to avoid flooding in other areas or standing water in other areas. So shifting inside a little bit, we also have some tips and some thoughts around climate change and food that we wanted to highlight as part of this presentation as well. So in the kitchen, it's important to recognize kind of globally that about half of food that's produced in the world is wasted, whether that be at various pieces along our food chain, as we would call it. And so, the graphic on the right, which is included in Food for All, New Brunswick's recent action guide for eaters, climate action guide for eaters, which is a really great resource to learn more about how climate change is linked with food security and food production and what tangible steps we can take to help to reduce our own food waste and our own impact when it comes to food with climate change. There's a lot of really cool tips. And so I really like the idea of, for example, one of the tips they mentioned in there is implementing a use next bowl in your fridge. So if you have some vegetables that might be going bad or something that might be going bad, you have a bowl that is your use next bowl in the fridge. When you open it up, okay, yeah, I got to remember to make a meal with that food before it goes bad. Coming back to one of the first tips, composting, of course, is a big one in terms of when we do have food that goes bad, being able to, again, keep it on your property, keep it from going to the landfill, and then being able to use that maybe in your gardens later in the next year or the year after that through composting. So thinking about shortening our food chain can also help with reducing emissions and keeps a lot of the dollars in the local economy as well. So in the Food for All guide, they break down, for every $10 that's spent in New Brunswick, for example, only about $4.50 actually stays within the local community. So a lot of what we can think about is, how can we support our local farmers through farmers markets or local community supported agriculture programs, or focus on home gardening more in order to keep more of that money within the local economy as well, which is obviously a huge benefit. And there's a number of farmers markets in our region and in many other regions across the country from wherever you're tuning into that you can tap into as well. And I really like this graphic that kind of shows the different steps that food takes to go on its journey from where it's grown to where it's eaten. And I think it really, sheds some interesting light on, obviously there's emissions that happen in each one of those steps and different things that happens at each one of those steps that we can try to, mitigate over time to help reduce our impacts. Kind of in more of a general sense, thinking about, if you're looking to take action as well, volunteering with local nonprofits who are doing some other climate change work, whether it be, planting green roofs or doing dune restoration projects or whatever it is, kind of involving yourself in some of those bigger projects can also be a great way to act, not necessarily just at your own home level, but also a number of nonprofits and environmental groups have, different programs that homeowners can take advantage of. Like I know EOS, for example, has had rain garden programs in the past where people can sign up to have a rain garden on their property, bulk purchases in terms of things that people can use to prepare for some impacts, these sorts of things. So definitely keep an eye out on what your local environmental group or environmental organization is doing, as there'll probably be ways that you can either get involved or benefit from getting involved in that. And for those of you who do live in New Brunswick who are on the call today, the New Brunswick Environmental Network website, NBEN, is a great place to start in terms of seeing all the groups that are out there and where they're located. Emergency planning, Amanda would probably be remiss if I didn't talk about emergency planning as well. So, similar to how can we work with nature outside and inside to prepare for climate change, it's also important to recognize that we do anticipate that we're going to be in, emergency situations from time to time. We're going to have to respond to those. So thinking about, do we have an emergency plan about what would happen if if our house gets cut or the road gets cut off from floodwaters and we're not able to, go into town for groceries for 3 or 4 days, or and those sorts of things. So making sure we have an emergency plan in place, making sure we have our 72-hour emergency kit. And for a full list of tips, of course, EOS has a lot of information on their website about how to get yourself set up for that. And I also just wanted to mention quickly as well, when it comes to climate change and the climate crisis, there's always going to be a conversation around mental health and eco-anxiety as well. And so I just wanted to throw this in there as another way that people can kind of take action in terms of making sure that, we're taking action. Yes, we're getting more informed, but we also want to make sure that we're, taking care of ourselves and not becoming too overwhelmed with the subject. And so there's a number of kind of ways that climate change and changes in the environment can impact our mental health. And so there's a number of resources and community resources that are out there for people, and we'll include some of those. And I guess I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm going to be putting together kind of a one-pager of different resources and links and things like that I've talked about through the presentation today that I'll hopefully send out to everybody through Amanda. And so I'll include a couple of interesting newsletters and different concepts in the context of mental health that will hopefully be helpful for folks too. And the real concept that's gaining a lot of traction recently is this idea of active hope. So kind of grasping onto pieces of action that we can take and being active in kind of cultivating hope for the future and in terms of what we can do to address climate change, and also celebrating success along the way. So those are just some recognizing that that is also something that we need to be thinking about as we kind of continue to take action. And yeah, there's a number of existing resources that are out there that people can check out in terms of not only what people can do to adapt to climate change, but also learning about what other groups are doing, as well as what impacts your community or your area is expected to face, which can also help kind of drive what people decide to do or think they can do around action. So I'm just going to actually wrap it up there, and we can have a bit of a discussion if we want, or have questions about some of these ideas or even other ideas that people have implemented on their own properties or in their own lives to take some climate action. So maybe I'll pass it back over to you, Amanda, if that works, and we can do some questions.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Adam. That was a great summary of so many different kinds of natural infrastructure projects, and then so many tips for homeowners. So that was actually a really nice way to wrap up this event series as well, kind of bring it all together. So thank you very much.